All right, A-Push students, let's do this. We're going to crack open period one. We're talking about the world before Columbus, all the way up to the founding of Jamestown in 1607. This is really where the whole story of American history gets started. Ready to dive in?
Okay, so first things first, let's set some expectations. This period, it's a pretty small slice of the exam, only about 4 to 6%. But, and this is a big but, don't let that fool you. What happens here builds the essential foundation for literally everything that comes after. If you get this, the rest of the course just makes so much more sense.
So, our timeline here is actually pretty simple. We're starting in 1491, which gives us a perfect snapshot of the Americas the year before Columbus arrives and changes everything. And we'll end in 1607 with the founding of Jamestown. That's the first permanent English settlement. And believe me, it kicks off a whole new era. It's a massive turning point.
Here's our game plan. We're going to hit all the big themes the AP exam loves to test, from the incredibly diverse world of native nations all the way to the very complex consequences of European arrival. So before we even whisper the word Europe, we have to understand this question. What was America actually like before 1492? Was it just some empty wilderness waiting to be discovered? No way, absolutely not. It was home to a vast, and I mean vast, range of incredibly complex societies, each with its own unique way of life.
And here is the single most important idea for this section. There was no one single Native American culture. It just didn't exist. We're talking about hundreds of distinct groups, and their amazing diversity was a direct result of how they brilliantly adapted to the specific environments they called home. And this chart just illustrates that perfectly. Think about it. You've got the Pueblo peoples in the desert Southwest who mastered maize agriculture and built these incredible permanent cliff dwellings. Now contrast that completely with groups like the Apache on the Great Plains, whose entire society revolved around hunting the bison, so they were largely nomadic. Then you go to the Northeast, and you've got the Iroquois, who perfected Three Sisters farming with corn, beans, and squash. And way out in the Pacific Northwest, the Chinook built this complex society all centered around the salmon runs. You see, each environment demanded a different kind of genius.
Okay, so we've established just how diverse and complex the Americas were. But what was going on in Europe? I mean, what on earth would drive people to risk everything to sail across a vast, terrifying, and completely unknown Atlantic Ocean? Let's get into it.
For the exam, you just have to remember the 3 Gs. It's that simple. First, gold. Europeans were desperate for new sources of wealth. Spices, gold, you name it. And they wanted a direct sea route to Asia to cut out the middlemen. Next, glory. New, powerful nations like Spain and Portugal were in this fierce competition for power and prestige. And finally, God. There was this powerful religious drive, especially from a newly unified Catholic Spain, to go out and convert the entire world to Christianity.
Now, these epic voyages weren't just fueled by desire, right? They were actually made possible by some key new technologies. New ships like the Caravel were smaller, faster, and could actually sail against the wind. And new navigational tools, like the astrolabe, let sailors figure out where in the world they were on the open ocean. This new tech literally unlocked the world.
So when Columbus arrived in 1492, it did so much more than just connect 2 continents. It triggered this planet-altering transfer of life. We're talking plants, animals, people, and crucially diseases that would forever, and I mean forever, change both the old and the new worlds.
This massive transfer has a name, and you have to know it: the Columbian Exchange. And honestly, its consequences were just monumental. It reshaped economies, it changed diets, it altered landscapes across the entire globe. It was a huge deal. So coming from Europe and Africa to the Americas were things that were totally transformative. On the one hand, you had these devastating diseases like smallpox and measles. But you also had animals like the horse, which would completely revolutionize life for native peoples on the Great Plains. And you had new crops like wheat and sugar. And then, going back the other way, the Americas sent Europe calorie-dense foods like potatoes and maize or corn. Now, this was not a small thing. This fueled a massive population boom back in Europe. And that, combined with all the gold and silver being pulled from the Americas, helped kickstart the entire shift towards capitalism. But listen, if there is one single thing you remember about the Columbian Exchange, it has to be this. The single most consequential part of it all was disease.
Native peoples had zero immunity to Old World germs, smallpox, measles. They led to a catastrophic demographic collapse, with mortality rates in many areas hitting as high as 90%. It was the deadliest weapon of the conquest, and it wasn't even intentional.
So, with native populations just decimated by disease, Spain suddenly had a new problem on its hands. How do you get all of that immense wealth out of the ground? This challenge led directly to the creation of new and often incredibly brutal systems of labor and social control.
Their first big attempt at this was something called the encomienda system. Now, on paper, the idea was that Spanish colonists were granted control over native labor, and in exchange, they were supposed to Christianize them. In reality, it was little more than a justification for brutal, forced labor. It was basically slavery.
This system sparked some pretty fierce moral debates back in Spain. You had priests like Bartolomé de las Casas who saw the horrors firsthand. He wrote about its brutality and argued passionately for the humanity of native peoples, which really ignited a huge conversation about the nature of conquest itself.
But in the end, the encomienda system didn't fail because of moral pressure. It failed for two very practical reasons. One, native people were dying from disease at an absolutely alarming rate. And two, the survivors knew the land and could escape. So, this failure pushed the Spanish to find a new, more controllable labor source: enslaved Africans. And that right there is a huge turning point in the history of the Americas. Now, to control this new, incredibly complex, multiracial society that was emerging, Spain created something called the casta system. This was a super rigid social hierarchy based entirely on your race and where you were born. At the very top, you had peninsulares, people born in Spain, and way down at the bottom were Native Americans and Africans. Your spot in this pyramid determined everything about your life: your rights, your job, your social status, the whole shebang.
Okay, so this whole period, it was not just a one-sided story of European conquest. It was so much more complicated than that. It was a story of cultural clashes, of deep misunderstandings, but also of adaptation and fierce, fierce resistance. I mean, fundamentally, Europeans and Native Americans just saw the world in profoundly different ways. Let's just take land, for example. For most Native groups, land was seen as communal and sacred. It wasn't something a person could buy or sell. For the Spanish, land was private property. It was a commodity. That difference alone was a constant source of conflict and misunderstanding.
And it is so critical to remember that Native peoples were not just passive victims in all this. They actively resisted European control. And the most successful example from this whole era is the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. This was a huge, coordinated uprising that actually drove the Spanish completely out of New Mexico for more than a decade. It was a powerful, powerful assertion of native autonomy.
Okay, so we have covered a ton of ground in a pretty short amount of time. Let's wrap this all up and focus on the most important cause and effect relationships that you absolutely have to know for that AP exam. So, let's boil it down. Here are the crucial takeaways. First, the environment is what created that incredible diversity among native societies. Second, the Columbian Exchange changed everything, but disease was its deadliest weapon and the key that enabled conquest. And third, the Spanish built their new empire on systems of forced labor, like the encomienda, and that rigid racial hierarchy, the casta system. Got it?
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Even though this period is short and it's a small part of your exam, the patterns it established of cultural exchange, of conflict over land, of new racial hierarchies, and of devastating environmental change, they laid the groundwork for the next 400 years of American history. And these are patterns with consequences that, you know what, we are still grappling with today.